Thank you for tuning into the Zelos podcast, the show that's all about the pros behind the pros. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder, and this week I've got Loren Landow on. He's been with the Denver Broncos organization for a number of years until recently kind of switching back into the private sector a little bit. We're going to talk about both, what it's like to be the head strength conditioning coach for an NFL team like the Broncos, as well as running your own performance facility not far away. He's also going to be speaking at this year's NSCA National Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, July 12th to the 15th. So make sure you register for that clinic. While you're at it, hit the subscribe button for this show. Follow us on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. And here we go. Loren Landow in the house with me. Can't thank you enough for spending a little bit of time. I mean, your time in the NFL and all sports considered, you've been doing this a long time. So I've been kind of giddy like a schoolgirl because I know I'm going to learn a lot just from our conversation. So first of all, welcome to the Zealous podcast, and it's a joy to have you on.
Appreciate it. Honored to be on, and let's share some of the good old days of going through this profession together. We've both been through it for a while now.
Truly. Now, so let's just start there. When did you start? How did you start cutting your teeth, and what got you inspired to get into professional sports?
Yeah, 29 years ago, I got into the field, and I think it was just like at that time, you and I both know there wasn't a lot of pure performance training happening. It wasn't in vogue, and there weren't facilities on every corner like there are now. And so I was just trying to learn from whoever I could. I sought out some incredible mentors in the path, but really I just started off as a good old-fashioned personal trainer. I knew that I wanted to work with athletes and, start with a lot of middle school, high school age athletes, and then, started to cut my teeth into some collegiate athletes. And by 1998, I worked with my first NFL combine class. And so that really got the juices flowing for this thing of performance training, speed development, and really ultimately looking at the efficiency of human movement. And then ultimately that grew into other sports. My path is I've always said there's no part in my path that I say was a mistake. I was the operations manager of a 140,000 square foot athletic club. I was a personal trainer manager. I went on and then I was part of the Velocity Sports Performance franchise. And so I've seen a lot of different iterations of performance training and how it's kind of morphed to become more mainstream. Once I was with Velocity Sports Performance, we morphed that. There's always different things that happen in business models that you learn from that are unfortunate circumstances, but you do learn from. And through Velocity Model, I learned a ton. And from there, I partnered with an orthopedic firm, and I started their performance branch, and that was the Steadman Hawkins Group. From there, I started performance training. We started their ACL return to sport and their ACL prevention program. I was a big part of developing those classes and those models. And then from there, I opened up Landow Performance. I was partnered with 5 doctors, and I kind of saw that they were uncomfortable building the model bigger. I knew that we had to go into bigger square footage based on the traction we were getting. So I bought out my partners and started Landow Performance. And, as they say, the rest is kind of history. And as I was building Landow Performance, I got the call for different sports teams, collegiately and professionally, and I turned them all down for interviews. And then
why was that? Why'd you turn them down?
I was at the point in time where I had to build my team. I had to build my team to make sure that the brand of Landow Performance could carry and be sustainable if I were to ever leave. And so I got to a point in time after I bought out my partners, 5 years in, and we were sustainable. I had the right people in place, and the Broncos job was coming open, and I got that phone call for interview, and I went with it, and the rest is history, as they say to that as well. So spent 5 years with the Denver Broncos, and now making a slight transition back into the private sector.
Well, definitely we've got some parallel paths. There's some that you just take it in a different direction, obviously with professional sports and working with the doctors to some degree, but there's so many things, getting mentors, opening opportunities whenever they happen, taking them and building a team that is sustainable. Yeah, definitely I can relate to that. But you mentioned ACL, and I would love to get into this because the statistic I recently saw was 11% of NFL players, just in the NFL alone, 11% are going to run into some ACL trouble from preseason all the way through postseason, and that's a huge percentage. I mean, almost a little bit more than 1 out of every 10 players is going to have something going on in their ACL. Now you've got protocol that you've established, you've created it. It's a methodology, and as I've read, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like a 4-stage process. I would love to go a little bit into that if you don't mind.
Sure. So a lot of the what you mentioned about the stage process, it's a 6-stage process of return to play. So kind of after the fact, once the injury has happened. But I think that's one thing we're seeing in sport, regardless if it's football or soccer or basketball. I mean, we're seeing a greater incidences of these types of injuries, and I'm sure the research shows a lot of different reasons, and they're multifactorial without a doubt. But I do think that there's some approaches that we can do. Look, I've been a part of trying to put those things together, and those things still happen. So there's no foolproof plan. You can go in with your best judgment and your best methods to this date and still have some bad things happen. And I've seen that.
Sure, we're talking about reducing the likelihood of injury, not injury prevention. We're not going to prevent.
You know what? And I think that's actually a great point that you bring up. I think that was one of the things that if we created a failure in our industry, it was always talking about reducing the likelihood of them. Like, these things are still going to happen, especially when you play chaotic driven sports with major amount of fatigue, major amount of speed, and a major amount of reactionary component. These things are going to happen. And so our goal is to reduce the likelihood, but saying injury prevention is a bad term that I think kind of put us in a no-win in our field. So, some of it's semantics, but at the end of the day, like, I think sometimes we're putting down something that is not always realistic. You and I both want to create the most efficient and most robust athletes that we can, but sometimes, as I say, physics wins.
Yeah. So for me, I see it in 2 camps when we're talking about the ACL or any other symptomatic, like, non-contact injury, where most of the time the ACL is. How do we bulletproof it as best we can through strength and conditioning? And then how do we, after the event occurs, when that happens, how do we get them to return to play? So there's going to be 2 different camps here, and you're saying you've got like a 6-stage process for return to play. So I'd love to kind of just hear a little bit about that, but I also want to hear, like, how do you try to reduce the likelihood through the strength conditioning aspects too?
Yeah, I think number one, first and foremost, you have to have a pretty solid screening process. Something that can be subjective and objective at the same time. You need to be able to walk away with definitive ideas. If somebody has had history, what we say, the number one predictor of injury is previous injury. Okay, I can't tell you how many athletes over the years that they won't even tell me about an ACL that they have. I get them on a table to do an assessment, a day 1 assessment, and I see a scar. And I can't tell you how many athletes I've put on a table and you see that scar and you're like, they almost forgot it even happened. But if you look back at the history, a lot of these athletes have had these things now. By the time they get to you, if they're in the professional level, they may have had them in high school or in college. And so there's a huge history of it, number one. So you have to have a strong assessment tool to sit there and say, okay, yeah, you may have had the injury, you may not have had the injury, but if you did, what was the graph with? Okay, and then you're going to start looking and assessing. Once you know the graph, you have an idea of maybe how long ago it was, sometimes the integrity of what was done. After the procedural process, like your surgery was only as good as the therapy done, and your performance training was only as good as the therapy that was done as well. So it's a starting process of range of motion reestablishment. You've got to reestablish a open chain range of motion, get the range of motion back into the knee joint, or even what the restriction was. Maybe the restriction was ankle, hip, or maybe it was truly the knee. And maybe it was just a fluke injury where the knee became the casualty. But regardless of that, you have to look at those 3 joints, in my opinion, to sit there and say, I'm giving this person the best opportunity to come back from this injury. as you're doing so, you restore the pain-free ranges of motion and the passive range of motion, and then you start getting into the active component. That active component has a multitude of layers. Number one, can I restore just proprioceptive awareness, reestablishing the connection? And so kind of that first phase is like active range of motion, proprioceptive. We always talk about there's an inverse relationship between mechanoreception and nociception. When we have an injury, when we have an insult, we have a decrease in mechanoreception, we have an increase in nociception. So we need to reestablish a lot of that proprioceptive feedback to start to reestablish the functional component of that joint.
And are you doing that in a closed chain environment to get the proprioception, or are you doing that also in an open chain on the table?
I would say once range of motion is restored, they do their open chain exercises to restore that range. I would say I go to closed chain right away.
Cool.
Get them balancing, get them on 2 feet, get them doing some postural shifts, get them into single leg control, like nothing above and beyond, but just trying to reestablish the connection. So once you get to that, you start, I always believe that I want to back engineer where I'm trying to get them to. So if I'm working on something that's proprioceptive based, I'm going to also at the same time start restoring mechanics, we can call it walking, jogging, running mechanics right away. And so that might have them stand in a single stance postural hold on the insult leg, and then the up leg hold a figure 4 position of maximum velocity mechanics. One, I can start cueing in that. I'm kind of letting them know where I want to get to, but I'm really setting the groundwork with all the proprioceptively enriched exercises. I'm not a big unstable surface guy. I think when we come back from these injuries, we're unstable enough. I don't need any help. However, if we look at like just foot kinematics, I'm a big barefoot guy though. So we look at the foot kinematics and we sit there and say, well, I have 26 bones and 56 joint articulations throughout the foot and the ankle complex. Like there's a lot of variability for instability. So I don't need to add it. So what I need to do is try to influence it the best I can and give this person the best capability early on in their rehab, because their stages of rehab are only going to be as good as I restored things on the front end. I see people all the time that have skipped major steps in their rehab because they're trying so quickly to get to the functional models. So
well, I think a lot of people also just view the foot as one joint, the ankle, and they don't see it as this three-dimensional opposing action when we're talking about the mechanics of pronation and supination. Here, what we do is we use small foam wedges to make sure we have the 3 points of contact down when we're loading into it. Is that first met staying in contact, or is it rolling off and they're actually not loading properly into the tissue? Is that fifth met or that calcaneus? And we can utilize these little wedges to encourage proper foot mechanics, kinematic sequencing, and so on. So it feeds up the chain all the way through that ACL and up into the glutes or wherever you want to talk.
Yeah, and that you bring up a great point, looking at the triplanar aspect of foot pressure. And, for me, they look at like open chain versus closed chain mechanics, and they just sit there and they say inversion of the foot or eversion of the foot.
Right.
I'm like, well, yeah, if I'm loaded, like the rear foot might be everted, but the midfoot might be pronated and the forefoot might be abducted. There's a cause and effect relationship with that foot, depending on how it's being loaded or even where it is in the different strikes of gait. So I agree with you. People do look at open chain and closed chain. So yes and no, no, there are phases to this thing. And that's the other thing I don't think people really take into consideration is with your rear foot, midfoot, and forefoot, you have triplanar influences in all 3 of those areas. So there's a lot of degrees of freedom of range of motion.
Yeah, so, like you say, the previous injuries, I mean, if anybody presents themselves to me with a previous injury of an inversion sprain, automatically they are in an orange flag zone for me, because no doctor is going to have a patient has an inversion sprain of varying degrees go seek physical therapy or proper re-education of the mechanoreceptors, like you say. And so that sets up this distorted pattern of movement that is going to put strain in certain areas and could very well likely be the ACL. So
yeah, and I think that's a great point as well, because You know, when you lose motion in one joint, you're going to pick it up somewhere else, or somebody else is going to be the compensatory factor. And when you start to lose it in that ankle, like you're just going to go right up the chain. At least the ankle joint we talk about, it has the ability to, you know, if we look at the talocrural joint, like if we look at the talocrural joint, and I can have the ability to go into dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, adduction, abduction, inversion, eversion, like. But if I start to restrict range of motion in any of those planes, the knee is going to become the torque converter. And the knee is primarily a hinged joint, has a little bit of rotation, but not a ton. And so you're asking more of it. And this goes back to one thing I've been talking about quite a bit in our field, is a lot of times in our field, we're striving for the stiffness thing, right? How quick can we rebound and explode and be elastic? But there's a flip side to that, is you better have the compliancy of the foot better have the ability to go into pronation. It needs to be able to go into pronation and then go into supination. You don't want to just lock somebody varimed and bow-legged and say, good luck, you're going to live in supination. And by God, I hope you don't get out of position, because then you're going to ask that knee joint to absorb more of those forces that they're not able to get into if they're not going into a pronatory stance.
Yeah, nor are they familiar with it. So when it comes to any kind of stretch shortening reflex, any proprioceptive awareness, if you're not driving that knee valgus and loading with a little external rotation or however you want to coin it, then how is it going to be prepared for those moments where it goes into the oh shit zone, right?
Because there's bandwidths of range of motion, and at the end of the day, like we're going to go into dynamic valgus, so we got to prepare them for it. But it's the ability to eccentrically control pronation, and then consequently eccentrically control supination. And that happens all the time in spatial movement. And people really don't really think about it like that. They're just like, all right, we're going to tape you up. We're going to restrict motion or restrict the ability to go there. And you said it beautifully, like there's this stretch shortening thing that is happening through the kinematics of the foot that for some reason we try to blunt in our field, and we just try to create all these stiffness modalities. And don't get me wrong, we drive for stiffness, but we also have to be able to work on the compliancy.
Truly. Well, we're just you're preaching to the choir as far as I'm concerned. I love it because I'm drooling over everything you say. So you bring up also, you're not a big fan of unstable surfaces, and I gotta say I agree with that. Unless you're an athlete that is on unstable surfaces, like specificity to training applies here as well. I think we as a culture within strength conditioning and fitness in general in America have thought that more is better. So if a little unstable environment has given us what we need, then suddenly we're standing on balloons or half domes and thinking that that's going to be really good for our athlete or our client. But what we're actually finding out, like if we just measure the autonomic nervous response, like what is the sympathetic or parasympathetic response to being on these unstable surfaces, we will see that the body goes more often than not into a threat response. And it actually is weaker. The balance is less. The body is in this threat system. And it's remarkable that I just see it occurring more and more. So what you do in your facility, I'm sure there's a progression onto those unstable surfaces if you in fact use them.
So you know what? Actually, there are some things I do like to do. So I take gymnastics mats. Okay, not really soft, but something that has a little bit of not rebound, but it has a little instability, but it's still pretty rigid.
Yeah.
My kind of goal is when I put somebody on an unstable surface, I try to avoid too much calcaneal depression into the piece, because then it changes the axis and the recruitment around the axes, and I don't think it necessarily is specific to surfaces that they'll be on.
Mm-hmm.
So my whole thing is I want to put you on something that's maybe a little bit softer, but not so much that I go into this excessive dorsiflex position where the calcaneus is dropped to the first ray significantly. And you see that all the time on the hypermobile devices. But I put them on gymnastics mats, and you'll love this. So, you know, whether you understand foot kinematics or not, you can at least have the same influence. So if I put somebody on this gymnastics mats, and I have it for about 10 yards in length, and I'll put them on their right foot single footed on the right foot. And then I have them hop off onto my turf floor and then quickly rebound back onto the gymnastics mat. The way I look at it, Rocky, is I'm working on the stiffness aspect by the quick rebound off the turf, and then they have to stick and stabilize on the gymnastics mat. So I'm forcing them the compliant component, and we'll do this all the way down for 10 yards on the right foot. The beautiful part about it is when I put them on the right foot on the outside edge, I'm working this pronatory control all the way down. When I switch to the other foot, it's the supinatory control all the way down. So I'm working on both aspects of eccentric control of pronation, eccentric control of supination, just by changing where I land and which foot I land on.
I love it.
So that's where I will play around with some of those surfaces. And, you know, a little bit goes a long way with those tools. I don't think you have to spend a ton of time. I think you bookend your sessions with them. And I do think that a little bit goes a long way with them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. I think that's a great drill. I love it because traveling to the right, one foot's going to land in a completely opposite action than the other. I mean, that's the beautiful thing about movement. We're talking about opposition. One bone moving in one direction while the other one moves in the other. Tissue is loaded, and then the opposite occurs.
Yeah, and actually, that you bring up a good point, because when the foot goes into excessive pronation, the talus goes into like more adduction, and then the tibia goes into internal rotation. And so what happens is you get that corkscrew that we always talk about, but it really starts at what's not being controlled by the foot. And so if we can have the ability to go there, but the ability to put on the brakes, I do think that we help these athletes with these retrograde forces back up the chain too, to be able to control coming back out of those positions when they cut quickly.
And obviously, you were with the Broncos for 5 years plus, and moving into somewhat of the private sector right now, back to your performance center. But what are the football players your most favorite athletes to work with? Just curious.
Ooh, you know what? I don't. People ask me that quite a bit. Like, who are my most favorite athletes? I love the football side of things, and I love the going after the trophy or going after the team goal. But I'll be honest with you, Rocky. Anybody that wants to be growth-minded, anybody that really wants to put the ego at the door, anybody that wants to be coached, those are my favorite athletes to work with. And so, you know, being back here in my facility, I'm back working with our UFC fighters. I'm back working with my NFL players and some of my retired NFL players. And I just love people that want to be coached and that want to attain the highest level that they can. Those are the things that are fun. Heck, I've enjoyed being back here and being with some of the younger athletes too. That's been a kick for me.
Well, you know, I had Al Vermeil, one of the legendary strength coaches that was, you know, with the 80s, he was with the Niners, and in the 90s, he was with Michael Jordan and the Bulls. And he will say it time and time again, if I had my choice, I'd still be in the high school as a strength coach there, because working with the young athletes is just where his heart is. So I can appreciate that. Tell me this though, Loren, out of all the sports, out of all the athletes, the type of athletes, which presented you with the most challenge, whether it was a mental challenge, a coaching challenge, which ones just made you go, oh man, this is going to be a battle?
Yeah, I think every step along the way, like I would say circumstantially, like trying to learn the sport of mixed martial arts when I was first introduced to it over 15 years ago. You know, I had one of my former football players who converted into MMA, and he said, hey, I want you, you were my strength coach for football, I want you to be it for MMA. I said, awesome. I don't know a thing about the sport. And so what I had to do is and it was probably over 15 years ago at this point, but I had to deep dive into all the main domains of the sport, you know, the jiu-jitsu side, the wrestling side, the striking side. And I had to go and I had to become an observer and really watch what it was all about. And then I really had to learn the sport. And so as I did so, you know, the KPIs start to jump out at you then of what was important and what wasn't as important as you think, and how much metabolic they actually get at tactical sessions, but what metabolic gaps were being had, because you can only go so hard against your teammate, you know, so you have to pull back a little bit. It's almost like a good practice squad player. They're not going to give their 100% best because the starters need to practice their skill set. So same thing on that side of things. I started to notice gaps in development before leading into the fights that I had to fill in my space. So I would say the most challenging, I wouldn't say it was from a personality standpoint, but it was just from a holistic understanding of the sport and where I could be best helpful for them.
Got it. Yeah, that sounds great. Now, when it comes to your toolbox, now a tool is just a tool, and we can use it and to the degree it is. Aside from your voice and your ears and your eyes, we'll take those elements of coaching and just understand that those are essential ingredients in the tools. But if we opened up your toy box of tools, what are the ones, like, not to endorse any one thing over another, but I'm curious, what's in your playground? What's in your toy box that you really enjoy?
Gosh, I enjoy space. I enjoy space, the ability to have athletes move and express force in open space. Like, that's a big deal to me. When I was designing our new facility, it was very important that I had a lot of open space. And even at the Broncos, I had a secondary weight room, and they said, well, what do you want? And I said, I want space. And that was to do a whole host of different things, whether it was sprinting, bounding, different plyos, different med ball throws, different crawling patterns. To me, having space was a luxury and still is. When it comes to other tools that I use, I love some of our diagnostics, our force plates. I love our gym wares. We have a grip of run rockets in here. And so I like those tools because I think I can do a lot on the performance side, but even on the return to play, tools like the run rocket have always been really helpful for me. Bringing back certain mechanics and working on, we started to touch on my sixth phase of ACL return, but as my phases go, like, it's super important to start getting into the locomotion patterns in low intensity elastic based exercises. And for me, the run rockets have been a fantastic tool in return to play.
And I'm glad you bring us back into that return to play. What's the graduation process? When do you just go, okay, let's go, let's do this?
Yeah, so I believe in a lot of, like, Dustin Grooms's work, where he talks about not trying to make a knee injury a head injury by always thinking about it and saying, hey, how's your knee feeling? Hey, how's your knee feeling that? How's your knee feeling that? I let them tell me. I let them tell me by what they show me. Hey, we're going to take it for a 20-yard skip. Everything looks clean and great. Boom. I don't have to ask anything. Okay. Then I start taking you into maybe some lunge patterns or some squat patterns. I start to see a shift. That might open up some questions for me. Is that pain, or is that a stereotype of movement that you've created because of the pain early on? But now you have no pain, but now you're just making that shift. So the graduation process is ultimately what I see with my eyes, what I hear in feedback. Those are a lot of the graduation process, because we always talk about, like, landmarks in return to play, but every athlete's so individual. But I do have, like, key tenets. By this time I should be here. By this time I should be here. But the graduation really comes down to what I see with my eyes and not trying to bias them. I will say this: I think a lot of times when we look at the return to play models, the athletes are in the brace quite a bit, and that creates a whole new stereotype of motion and movement. So in my opinion, like, if I've implemented something with you new and we've done it a few times with the brace on, I'll probably take you out of the brace and just work through the stepping mechanism of it so you don't lose that range. Because the brace will stereotype an early block and knee flexion. And then instead of the thigh coming through and gait in more of an elastic standpoint, you have to start lifting and raising with the hip flexors, because you're not getting that full flexion of the knee joint to create the whipping action of the elasticity of the anterior side hip flexors. So to me, it's making sure that I'm eradicating some of the issues that do happen in traditional rehab at the same time, but also I'm not over biasing, like, hey, how does this feel? Now, when I go into my rehab and I start going into my drillings further, I start with a velocity mindset first and foremost. So I start with a top end speed and mechanism. I start my stepping drills where I step over ankle, knee, and hip. And as I start to see that joint close in the knee, I know that I can take them into maybe bigger amplitude with it. Now we'll take it into a jogging tempo. Now I can take it into more of a running tempo. So I'll start to build in those drills, but I build it in my maximum velocity type drills first, because there's not a lot of speed under it. There's not a lot of force under it. I'm just hitting positions. I'm just hitting positions and influencing patterns. As they start to show me that they start to feel good there, now I start applying force into the ground. And now I'll start getting to more of my acceleratory positions, whether it's, and I'll start doing my wall drills early on, because I'm not really displacing a ton of force. But once they show me that they can handle those velocity-based drills, then I'll start implementing force-based drills. Like we're going to do some heavy resisted marches, whether it's anterior loaded with a sled or posterior loaded with a run rocket. But it's heavy, and now they have to start applying force into the ground. Once they start applying force and they have no pain and they're not showing any restrictions in range of motion, now I start blending force and velocity together. So now
Is that your reassessment? Is that you provided them with stimuli here in one aspect, and then is there pain or restriction? Are those the two that you basically go to?
Yeah, pain and restriction. And I'd say the biggest thing I get into is orchestration of movement. When I don't see a disturbance of rhythm, I know things are feeling pretty good. I know that we're elastic. I know that each joint on the left and right side, whichever the insulted side is, when I see like good holistic rhythm, we're in a good place. So
I'm so glad you didn't use the word bad or good side, but insulted. In fact, that's a great term. Yeah, that it was insulted, and so now we're just trying to basically make it feel better. You can't remove the insult, but we can address it and move through it. There's the power of words. Like you say, it may be semantics, but I think it's much more powerful than that. When I have people coming in and say, this is my bad shoulder, I will jokingly say, did it leave the wife and run to Indonesia with the next door neighbor or something? Because that's bad.
That's bad.
But that shoulder may be a warrior. That may have gone through the trenches and it's still hanging there doing the best damn thing it can. Maybe it was working harder than it needed to and just couldn't hold it anymore. Like if we can create those concepts in our own mind as to what the body is going through, it changes our perception of what that body is dealing with. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And I commonly joke with my athletes when they say my bad side, I say, you have a good side and you have a better side.
Oh, there you go.
You have a good side and a better side, and our goal is to get good to better. And that's ultimately where I try to leave it with them. And I don't grease them with, falsities, and I make sure that I'm being very honest with them. But I'm also very quick. I think athletes are very quick to be hard on themselves, and I'm very quick to say, here's the silver lining. Here's what we couldn't do 2 weeks ago. Now look where we're at. And so to me, those are really big takeaway moments when you're dealing with somebody in the return to play, because for us, it's our job to know where they came from a week ago, 2 weeks ago, or even a day ago. And for them, it's very hard because they just go back to where they were before the injury. And so what you have to do is you have to create perspective for them. You have to take perspective for them of what was taken away and what we're restoring. And so I'm always pretty good at doing that piece of it. Now going through that, going into the rehab process a little bit further, like we do get to the times where now we have to start pushing the velocity and the force together, and we have to start challenging them with deceleration patterns and all those things. But I also have like different landmarks that they have to do. If you can't squat and lunge without some sort of discrepancy, you're not ready to decelerate. And if you were to ask me what are the biggest problems I see in the return to play is, it's the return to specificity way too soon. This person was a wide receiver, and we know they're going to run this many routes and they're going to run this many yards. So we got to make sure that we retain their capacity. Well, is the goal retaining capacity, or is the goal restoring function? We need to restore function first. That needs to be our number one KPI. And then we restore capacities when we're able. But if I don't have good, clean locomotion, like all I'm doing is creating a bad stereotype of the pattern. So I think if I were to sit there and say, what are some things I see in our field that we do poorly, is we try to return specificity way too soon. We have to restore functionality.
And really what you're talking about is either spitting them out and chewing them up as players, chewing them up and spitting them out, that is, or longevity. Like one is going to be focused on one or the other. And I think historically with the NFL and other sports are just churn them in and out. Anybody gets injured, if they can't come back right away, they're gone. But your approach is one that takes a different beat, a different direction. Like, no, we're going to bring them back. We're going to bring them as good, if not better than before, but we're going to do it in a very progressive, methodical manner. That is going to be the highest insurance policy.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that. I remember my first year in the NFL, and we had an athlete who had he was an older athlete, and he had an Achilles tear. and very successful athlete. And I remember telling him he was a little bit further into his career. And I remember telling him, I said, look, if you listen to the things that I tell you and the athletic trainers tell you, I said, you will come back faster than you were before. And you could kind of see him looking at me like, you're full of it. And it was funny. I think we were 5 to 6 months in, and he was faster than he had ever been via the catapult. We saw him hit speeds that he had never hit before. So, and he went on to play another 5 years post that injury and played at a very, very high level. So to your point, like sometimes when those injuries happen, you know, there's a huge opportunity coming out the other side of it that a lot of athletes can't see. But if you can, if you're confident in your, if you're confident in your progressions, if you're confident in your eye, it's a huge opportunity to get them to a level that they've never been at before.
I bet. Now, when it comes to working, you mentioned the athletic trainers and being on the team. Of course, this is a huge team of professionals, athletic trainer, assistants, athletic trainer, physical therapist, strength coach, and what did you contribute when toward the medical end of the spectrum, and what did you receive from them? Because there has been, again, I'll just say, use the word historically, a gap between the strength room and the treatment rooms. And but it's less and less these days, I believe. I think there's going to be a melding and a marriage between. The language is becoming more homogenous. But in your time within the NFL, and for that matter, other teams, if you want to throw them in there, what was it that helped you kind of close that gap?
I think the biggest thing, and we talk about it all the time, is communication. You know, you can go into a lot of teams, and there's silos that are built up. And you know, even when I went to the NFL, I had heard, you know, there's a lot of silos. And my number one goal was like, how do we make each other? How do we get things horizontal? And to me, it was communication. And so I was adamant. I was in the athletic trainer's office every morning, first thing in the morning, and we would go over the athletes together, and we would. The biggest thing is we just had our debriefs. We'd have a morning, a noon, and an afternoon or early evening debrief, and we'd go through the day. Here's what we have coming up for the day, and here's how this person did, and here's how I had to remove this from this person. But man, this person really excelled. Like, we just had this constant communication. And I think during my time at Denver, we had a really strong relationship. Myself and the head athletic trainer, Vince Garcia. I mean, we talked all the time. Like, it was incredible. And I think those things helped us, plus our nutritionist at the time as well, Brian Snyder. The three of us met quite frequently about how we were going to handle different cases. And I think because of that, you know, every NFL team is gonna deal with injuries, but I feel that we really did a good job of communicating how our plan was moving forward to get them, you know, back on the field, whether it was short-term, moderate-term, or long-term athletes. And communication is the number one thing, and it's hard. You know, you've got so many things being thrown at you, whether you're in the season, and sometimes it's hard to keep those communication points up. But we found an opportunity to do so, if not 2, if not 3 times a day, and sometimes even more.
Wow. Okay. And somewhat non sequitur. And I don't like going back to COVID, but I'm just curious, like, how did you survive with your private performance business and strength coach with the Broncos there during the pandemic? It must have been just a nightmare to some degree, but what was that like?
Yeah, it was a nightmare is a good way to put it. You know, we were learning things. As I tell everybody, you're building the plane as you're flying. During COVID, you know, every week or 2 weeks, there were new rules, there were new regulations. And almost what I did, Rocky, is whatever was coming down the pike via the NFL, I was mandating to have happen at my facility. And so whether it was before I think a lot of the counties and everybody came in and said, here's what these limitations are, I just started implementing what the NFL was. And our business closed here on the private side for a while. I was just joking about it with somebody today. I had two players that were training with me in the facility, and that was it. We had 2. And so because of it, it was like a ghost town. It was a really bizarre time. But there was a point in time we thought we were going to lose our private facility, and that was a concern. One, what was the new normal going to be? And at the time, Rocky, I had a 8,900 square foot facility, but I had 20 coaches. And when they started coming out with what the capacity mandates were going to be, I remember calling up my facility manager and I said, Amber, I said, if we don't, I said, you're going to think I'm crazy, but if we don't go into a bigger facility, we're going to lose our coaches are going to lose their livelihood. And so what we did is during COVID, we doubled down and went into a 15,000 square foot facility, which was kind of a roll of the dice, but it's worked out beautifully. So, things happen for a reason, and that one's turned out pretty well. But I will say this, I've told strength coaches, I said, if you happen to be a strength coach in the NCAA, any of the pro sports during COVID, you have a skill set that no other coach has, because we had to jump through more hoops and we had to implement different things that were you could have never dreamed up in a normal year. So I felt that we learned how to adapt. I felt we learned how to be resourceful. I felt we learned what we could get away with in development, and what we had to have big rocks because there was so much time issues, and you could only have 10 players in a 10,000 square foot weight room. Wow. It was great. It was crazy. So, you learned how to multitask pretty well.
I bet. Well, yeah, I just can't even imagine. I mean, I've just got a small facility and we were able to convert online instantly, but the lessons you learned from that will stay with you. Yeah. Surviving. Oh. You mentioned roll the dice, and that takes me to Las Vegas. And so we're both going to be in Las Vegas in the middle of July from the 12th to the 15th. The National Strength Conditioning Association's national conference is occurring then, whether in person or virtually online, and you're going to be presenting. I would love to get a little sneak peek about what you're presenting on, and maybe you can just entice the listening audience to come and join us. So what's your talk going to be on?
So I'm a part of a pre-con presentation that is Snyder, Ian Jeffries, myself, and Doug Lentz. We're going to go through, all four of us are going to go through kind of a long-term athletic development model of speed and agility, and how to take it from the early adolescence and transition it into the pro athlete, and then transition it into the older adult. So it's kind of like a long-term athletic development for life. Here we go. on the movement side.
I'm totally excited to get into that, especially when you're bringing in early adolescence, because it's going to be, I in my mind, I could be wrong, but it's going to be completely different as the spectrum continues, like compared to the teenage years, 20s, and so on. So, and you got Boo's been on the show before. He's a great guy. Awesome. Have you worked with him before?
Boo and I have spent some time together, especially in the New Orleans conference last year. And I just think the world of him as a coach, and what he has done and does for our field. And then, Ian Jeffries, everything that he's put forth into our field, and same with Doug Lentz. So I'm excited to be on the stage with them. And I'm going to be taking kind of the angle of how do we take this speed model and this agility model, how do we morph them together into all needs necessary for offensive and defensive players in sport.
Fabulous. Wow, that's great. Okay, now let's just say the phone rings tomorrow. You pick it up, and it's an NFL team going, "Hey, Loren, I heard you're hanging out at your facility. What say you come and work for us?" Or are you going to dip back into the NFL?
Let's go after that trophy, baby.
Yeah. All right.
Let's go. Oh. Two things that are driving me: confetti coming from the sky, and the trophy that you hold in the hand.
And you've had that experience, haven't you?
I have not had that experience. I need that experience.
Okay. It's the carrot on the stick. What about other sports? I mean, you're quite versed in a whole bunch of different fields, but what about if the NHL calls you up, Major League Baseball, NBA? I mean, the Nuggets are. I'm imagining
they're doing fine. They don't need my involvement. You know what? I would listen to anybody and everybody. To me, I really enjoy, spending the time here with my team at Landow Performance, and kind of, trying to make everybody a better practitioner, and they're making me a better practitioner. So I kind of like where my feet are right now, but if somebody called me, chasing that trophy, it'd be hard to say no.
Okay. Now, the majority of listening audience for this podcast are, I would say, 65% male and 35% female, between the ages of 20 to about 35. and they're the aspiring strength coaches, athletic trainers, and the like. What kind of advice would you offer them if they wanted to pursue a similar path as yourself and getting into professional sports and being a head strength coach?
Yeah, I think the advice that I would kind of impart is never look at any, kind of like what I said earlier. I don't look at any part of my journey as like a failed step or oh, I wish I hadn't done that, because each part of my step has led me to where I am today. So look at every opportunity as an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to develop. I think too many times we have coaches who are they're never where their feet are, and they might be at one job, but they're thinking, how can I get to this next job? And they job hunt, or they job hop all the time. Embrace yourself where you're at, be where your feet are, and take in the information. And honestly, I hear Dan Paff say it all the time, is you got to sink your teeth into, your mentors, 3 to 5 mentors, find them, but also pick out people that maybe will help you deal with your confirmation biases. Work with people who maybe aren't necessarily as tight into, if I'm a movement guy, I need to go, work with, more guys on the Olympic side. I need to work with more guys on the powerlifting side. Like, don't try to just surround yourself with people that are going to confirm your bias.
I like that. Okay, so who are your mentors? Do you have any right now?
I do. So, my mentors from day one are still the same. Greg Roscoff, who's a muscle activation technique specialist, Tom Purvis, who's a biomechanist genius, Dan Paff, Lauren Seagrave, Stephen Plisk. To me, Dan and Lauren are my movement guys who I started to, create a understanding of efficiency of movement. But then, like yourself, Rocky, and other people who have we stand on the shoulders of giants in our field, and everybody you walk into are mentors. Either they've helped provide your path or they help continue your path. And I look at the Ian Jeffries of the world and the Boos, to me, and Stu McMillan, like all those different people who provide great insight and question common practices. I think those are huge. Stephen Plisk, I mentioned him, and I think he's one of the sharpest minds we've had in our field when it comes to planning, programming, and periodization.
Fantastic. Okay, so going outside of your comfort, your hallway, where does that take you? If you're the movement guy, so to speak, where are your eyes wandering for more insight and information experience?
Yeah, so it's funny is my wife asked me, she said, what are you going to do this year? And I said that the goal this year is to fill some gaps. And so I wanted to learn more about acute chronic workloads and ratios. And so I went to Tim Gabbett's course. I want to hear from the guy who's putting out the information. I'm going to Matt Jordan's course on force plates in 2 weeks. Like, I want to go hear it from the people who are the specialists in our field. I'm really interested in the work that Francis Holloway is doing on anthropometric measuring and how much skeletal mass a frame, or how much muscle mass a skeleton can hold. And is there a tipping point of this ratio getting too high that we're greater predisposition to injury? I am wanting to solve the riddle of injury in sport. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to learn from some really smart people and try to fill some gaps.
Well, there's another kind of coincidence there, or commonality, is that we like puzzles and like trying to solve puzzles. Is it always been that way? Do you like detective shows? Like hunting down the clues to the end?
Love it. I always tell my wife, we'll be watching something and I'm like, here's what's going to happen. She's like, you don't know that. And next thing you know, it happens. So I've always been intrigued with trying to solve things. I just love it. And, I think injury in sports, it's a riddle, and it's really, really a challenging one to solve. But you got to get lucky in aspects of it, but you also have to surround yourself with a really good team, and you have to really pay attention to trends.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, well, we're coming up against the clock, Loren, and I could keep on going here because you've been just pumping out some amazing advice, and I truly appreciate it. If people wanted to follow you, not necessarily as asking for a mentorship from you, but if they just want to just get an insight as to who you are, what you've been doing within social media, websites, where can they go?
Sure, pretty simple. I'm really just on Instagram at this point. It's Loren Landow is my personal site, and then our company site is Landow Performance. But we're going to start putting out a little bit more content in the coming months here. So keep your eyes peeled.
And don't forget, we've got the NSCA National Conference coming up where Loren's going to be there too. Do you have any other conferences, by the way, that you're going to be speaking?
Actually, nothing. I did the Georgia State Conference a couple months ago, but I think some things will come up in the next 6 months or so.
Well, I look forward to that.
I'm trying to hold a low profile a little bit. I got some downtime.
Yeah, well, enjoy that downtime, but don't make it last too long. We've got some learning and some work to do, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
This has been great. I really want to thank you for coming on, and I look forward to when we can meet in person come a month or so down the road.
Awesome, Rock. Appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much.
So that brings us to a close for this episode of the Zelos podcast. I just want to thank Loren for coming on and having a great conversation. As it turns out, we're both going to be presenting at the NSCA National Conference on the same day at the same time. So I'm a little bummed about that because I really want to sit in and listen to all the things he's going to be speaking about. So the nice thing is, though, hopefully these will be recorded. So whether you're going to attend in person or virtually, you might get a second chance at listening to all the great information that's out there. Go to NSCA.com to register right now, and we'll see you next week. Remember, every Monday, 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern, we have a new episode with some amazing guests. Until next week, have a good one.